Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today on the traditional territory of the Algonquin peoples, unceded, and thank them for their generosity. Miigwech. I also want to thank the Honourable Member for Davenport for splitting time with me. I need to say that the circumstances are not those that lend me to feel particularly relieved or happy, but I am grateful for the civility of giving me 10 minutes, because otherwise I would not be able to speak at all because of the egregious use of time allocation on an omnibus bill. I never expected to see this after the change in government, that we'd see omnibus bills with time allocation. This is 3 bills put together. The National Energy Board Act changed, the Navigable Waters Protection Act changed, and the Environmental Assessment Act overhauled. The 4th piece that had been running along in tandem through the great good judgment of the Minister of Fisheries is Bill C-68. It stands on its own, and it's an excellent piece of legislation. But with the time available to me, Mr. Speaker, I'm only going to be able to speak to the impact assessment piece of this omnibus bill, which I'm afraid falls below any standard of acceptability and should trouble deeply any Liberal who stood in this place and voted against Bill C-38 in the spring of 2012. Every single Liberal MP, every single New Democrat, we stood together against the destruction of decades of environmental law. And how that process has been captured by the same mentality and the same values and the same principles that led to Harper destroying these acts, so that we now have a repackaged version of those same principles of eroding environmental assessment, is something that caucus should try to figure out, but I hope it will lead to changes in committee. So at the time available to me, Mr. Speaker, I'll quickly review my background in environmental law. I happen to be an environmental lawyer. It's by even weirder fluke that when I was 22 years old and a waitress and cook, I participated in the very first environmental assessment panel hearing in Canadian history in 1976. It was in Cape Breton. It was the Wreck Cove hydroelectric plant. I've participated in dozens and dozens since. 10 years after that, I was in the Minister of Environment's office. I was actually the person as senior policy advisor who took the quest from Environment Canada, from a wonderful senior civil servant named Ray Robinson, who headed the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency in those days. We took to Privy Council office the request to legislate, because up till then we'd been operating under a guidelines order that required environmental reviews, but was a bit uncertain in its full rubric. Some people thought it was a guideline, so therefore it wasn't binding. We got permission to legislate. Subsequently, I resigned my job with the Minister of Environment when the Minister violated the environmental assessment review process guidelines in approving dams without permits. This is just to say that I didn't come upon only recently my commitment to proper and thorough environmental assessment in Canada. It's nonpartisan. It goes back decades. Now, what happened under Bill C-38 was the destruction, the repeal of our environmental assessment process, and the replacement with a rather bogus process. So the question before us now, we can compare this Bill C-69 to the bogus process in C-38 in 2012, or we can compare it to what's needed. It's all well and good for the federal Liberals to say to us today, we did a lot of consultation. It's true. There were 21 cities with public hearings and over 1,000 people showed up to a superb expert panel on environmental assessment. The question before us today is, why were their recommendations ignored? I'm going to read the recommendations that were ignored one at a time. There are many. But in previous debate in this place, when the bill was first put forward, the parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Environment claimed that I was wrong in my assertion, which I think is fact, that the environmental assessment expert panel was ignored. It's really important to understand the point of environmental assessment. So I'll just go back a bit and say that's one of the pieces of Harper think that has survived into Liberal think. Environmental assessment has never been about a green light, red light, yes, no, the project goes ahead or it doesn't. It's primarily a tool for good planning. In the entire history from 1976 to 2012, when Harper repealed the Act, in that whole history, only 2 projects were ever given a red light. I say that again, from 1976 till 2012, with the thousands of environmental reviews that were done, only twice did a federal provincial environmental review panel say this project is so damaging it can't be mitigated, we must say no. It's primarily been about studying a process thoroughly, studying a project thoroughly, deciding we can mitigate the damage if only the proponent would agree to better scrubbers, if only the proponent would change the location slightly, if only, and in the course of the review process, many, many projects were improved. The damages mitigated and reduced, and in the end, a much better project was accepted. This has never been primarily about how to get to yes or no faster. That's what Harper thought, and apparently that thought process has somehow infested some ongoing decision-making process within government. So environmental assessment is about good planning. The Environmental Assessment Act, up until 2012, said the purpose was to get in and review a project as, quote, as early in the planning process as possible and before irrevocable decisions are made. So let me just quote from what we heard from the expert panel for what environmental assessment should contain. And they did agree that it should be called impact assessment. That is one piece, you could claim that. Page 5, quote, the Impact Assessment Authority should be established as a quasi-judicial tribunal empowered to undertake a full range of facilitation and dispute resolution processes, unquote. This has been ignored. The panel, your expert panel that you send around the country, you've heard about them, 1,000 people participated, 800 submissions. Their recommendation to government was don't have ad hoc panels where you pull people on different projects, always having different panels. Develop expertise through a quasi-judicial tribunal. Ironically, this was also the advice from the Red Book Liberal Platform of 1993. Second point, have time limits and cost controls that reflect the specific circumstances of each project, not the current one-size-fits-all approach. That was an innovation under C-38. They go on to, this is a key point, projects need to be reviewed whether they're big or small. The effect of Bill C-38 that Harper brought in, the previous era had seen approximately 4,000 projects a year reviewed, most of them with paper screening exercises that didn't take much time. After C-38, it shrunk to fewer than 100 a year. 4,000 a year, fewer than 100 a year. The Liberals have gone with perpetuating the fewer than 100 a year. And this is how they've done it, by ignoring this advice. The panel says federal interests, when you should have a review, include, quote, at a minimum, federal lands, federal funding, and federal government as a proponent, as well as, and then they list species at risk, fish, marine plants, migratory birds, indigenous issues, and so on. At a minimum, this piece of legislation ignores anything except a project list. That was an innovation of C-38. No law list reviews requiring that if the Navigable Waters Act or the Fisheries Act requires a permit from the minister, there be a review. No requirement that when federal money is spent, there be a review. That's the advice you got from your expert panel, ignored. They also said clearly from the expert panel that there should be no role at all for the National Energy Board, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, or the offshore petroleum boards. And they point out the federal system prior to 2012, quote, had decades of experience with delegating final decision-making to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and the NEB, unquote, without those agencies meddling in the environmental assessment. What's happening under C-69 is like a shell game. We're told it's one agency, independent, except when it's reviewing pipelines, the panel must be comprised of people who are sitting members of the NEB, now called the Canadian Energy Regulator. If they're reviewing offshore petroleum operations in Atlantic Canada, the panel members must come from the offshore petroleum boards, which by legislation are required to expand offshore oil. It's an embedded conflict of interest in the legislation. And the atrocities continue, Mr. Speaker. Indigenous rights. How is it that the Minister of Fisheries can put before us Bill C-68, which has strong language to protect Indigenous rights? C-68 at Section 2.3, Rights of Indigenous Peoples, makes it clear the Act cannot derogate from Indigenous rights. 2.4 says it's the duty of the minister when making a decision to consider adverse effects on rights of Indigenous peoples. This piece of over-discretionary political masquerading of environmental assessment of C-69 merely says the impact that a designated project may have on any Indigenous group is a factor to be considered. I can tell you as a former litigator, The courts do not regard Indigenous rights as a factor to be considered as protecting Indigenous rights. This bill gets an F. Please, in committee, let's at least get it to a C+.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't question the member's passion on the topic. In fact, her history, she's well illustrated, just to what degree she's been involved on this particular file. But having said that, I think that there is an expectation that the government have a process in place which incorporates legislation that recognizes that there is an Indigenous factor, a environmental factor, and a energy to market factor that has to be taken into consideration in terms of what the needs of Canada are going forward. And would she not, at the very least, look in terms of, we have, on the one hand, the Conservatives saying we've gone too far. We have the NDP and the leader of the Green Party saying we haven't gone far enough. At the very least, let's allow the bill to go to committee. I understand her concerns in regards to speeding this thing through. I can assure her that if it were up to some members of this House, this legislation would never pass the House. So unfortunately, at times, through time allocation, it's a tool that we require. The question I have for her is, would she not agree that at least it is a step forward? Maybe not the leap she would like to see, but it is a step forward.
For Saanich Gulf Islands.
Mr. Speaker, and to my honourable friend, Parliamentary Secretary, Leader in the House, my commentary is not based on what I'd like to see as an environmental activist. It's a public policy question of, is it good legislation? It is, objectively speaking, not good legislation. It is so wide open to discretion that although one might say, well, look at our current Minister of Environment, one can't imagine her ignoring Indigenous rights and ploughing something through. But legislation is for all time, for different governments. And even if I thought that there was no chance in a million years of any misuse of discretion in the current government, why would I sign off on a piece of legislation that is so, empirically speaking, deficient? It is not good legislation.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Edmonton Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened to the speech of the honourable member. She's definitely very experienced on green and energy and environment in general. And she mentioned the pipelines. She mentioned the balance, the Indigenous community. How does she envision a pipeline going anywhere west or east in Canada with the balance to get the pipeline going through? Where does she see the balance in order to get pipelines through Canada, either to the west coast or to the east coast?
Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I thank my honourable colleague from Edmonton Manning. I think it's a question of looking at the evidence, having a full, impartial hearing where witnesses can be cross-examined, assertions can be tested, the truth can be determined. In the case of pipelines, I'm not against any particular pipeline. The question is always, what's in it? If it's a pipeline with bitumen and diluent, it can't be cleaned up. Should you wish to build a pipeline to bring more BC wine to Alberta, I'm all for it.
Questions and comments. We have time for a brief question and with a brief response. The honourable member for Skeena Bulkley Valley.
Distracted about the idea of a pipeline filled with great BC wine, as much as Canadians would probably like to see that happen. My question is very simply for my friend, both on process and on the substance. Liberals promised not to bring in omnibus legislation. The Speaker of the House has determined that to be this. After 2 hours of debate, Liberals brought in time allocation, shutting off the conversation when they promised that they wouldn't do this. And on the substance, and I suppose we need to bring this into the real world, and here's my question for my friend. The Prime Minister, when campaigning for the job, said that the Kinder Morgan pipeline, for example, had been put under a bad review, and that he would put it under a proper review. If the Prime Minister had done his job and actually subjected that project, the diluted bitumen project, planned to go to Vancouver, with the Premier of our province, British Columbia, having to be doing the makeup work after the fact, after the approval process, to find out things like how does one handle a spill of diluted bitumen, either in fresh or salt water. that if the Prime Minister had followed through on his commitment to have good legislation go through decent process, that projects would be reviewed properly, would we be in the circumstance that we're in with the conflict with First Nations people and the people of British Columbia and now the Government of Canada?
For Saanich Gulf Island, and 30 seconds or less, please.
Well, the honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley is absolutely right. The question he suggests to me suggests its own answer, which is that, of course, had we not been put through a process that is not part of that history of environmental review that I reviewed, the National Energy Board had no expertise in doing reviews, and this allows me to mention another carryover bad aspect of C-38 into C-69, and that's the time limits that were put in C-38 is how it was that the National Energy Board determined they would not allow people like me as an intervener to cross-examine Kinder Morgan's witnesses, which led to abuse of process and not really getting to the facts of the matter. That aspect of time limits has not only been continued in C-69, the time limits have been shortened.